Hello again, everyone. This week we're talking about child physical abuse. We're covering Chapter 4 in the Barnett textbook. And I have again split this lecture up into two different parts just to make them a little more accessible to you, perhaps. The first part really kind of involves the definition of physical abuse, what child physical abuse is, and the different debates about what should and should not be considered abuse, and also some taking a look at some of the effects of physical abuse on its victims. So the first thing we want to do is to try to define what child physical abuse is. And there are different definitions for this, as you can see by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 1988, really kind of differentiated between two different types of harm that can come from physical abuse. The harm standard, which says that children who are physical abuse victims themselves have had observable injuries that have lasted at least 48 hours. Now, that 48-hour period isn't in statutes, and it isn't anything carved in stone. This is sort of a guide that I believe HHS suggested states use in defining what it means to be harmed because of physical abuse. However, in your work, if you're working in child protection, you don't have a 48-hour yardstick or anything that you have to abide by. But that's just one way of understanding this. As opposed to children who have been directly harmed or already harmed, there is also the endangerment standard, which suggests that children are abuse victims if they're thought to be substantially at risk for injury. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that a child has to have been injured by their parent in order to fall into the definition of child physical abuse if there is a substantial risk, and it can be, it can't be predicted obviously, but it can be more or less foreseen that it will occur. In Alaska, with our current model, as we look at what we call child safety when we do investigations, the model splits the safety threats into two different types, or danger into two different types. That is present danger and impending danger. Impending means something that hasn't really happened yet, but could happen. It is likely to happen if the current situation continues as it is. And you can see here with the harm standard and the endangerment standard, you're really kind of looking at present danger and impending danger. That's another way of seeing that. CAPTA is another federal program that looks and defines child abuse, and I don't recall the child abuse PTA. I don't know. I forget what that stands for. It's in your text, but in any event, the CAPTA definition says any recent act or failure to act by a parent or caretaker that results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Again, you have that immediate harm and endangerment in that definition as well. And finally, the Center for Disease Control in 2008 defined physical abuse as the intentional use of physical force by a parent or caregiver against a child that results in or has the potential to result in physical injury. Now, when we talk about child abuse, of course, one of the questions is, where is the line? Are we saying that a parent can't strike a child, that spanking is wrong or against the law? Well, at least I believe in all 50 states, I think it's safe to say that what is true in Alaska is true elsewhere, that spanking is not against the law. The use of corporal or physical punishment is not against the law in the United States. Whether or not it ought to be is a separate discussion, but in this country, physical discipline is acceptable according to our statutes. And so this then means that we have to try to determine what is normal, quote unquote, normal violence in child rearing. Is slapping a child across the face considered normal? Normal violence, is that acceptable? Paddling the child, using objects, that is, to hit the child, and paddling on the buttocks or paddling on the back of the legs or slapping one's hands, those kinds of things. So the question is, what is considered or deemed to be normal and what is not? And that's the source of quite a bit of debate among individuals, even that work in the field for that matter. And then there is this difference between physical punishment and protective physical restraint. Although anger, physical attack, and pain are involved between two people of vastly different size, weight, and strength, such behavior is commonly accepted as the proper exercise of adult authority over children. I mentioned to you, I believe a week or two ago, that there is sort of a truism in our society, at least in my experience, that if you strike at your neighbor child for whatever reason, you're angry at this child for something he said or did, and you slap that child, most likely you're going to get arrested and charged with assault and perhaps or battery and taken to jail. If you do the same thing with your own child, because you don't like what the child did, what you find oftentimes is the determination to be made, well, this is normal physical discipline, this is parenting more or less. And so there is a dichotomy in that. Again, I think that reflects the sense that we have some ownership interests in our children, which again suggests that children are property, and that's another discussion that we'll be going back to a few times during the semester. But what is the difference between physical punishment and protective physical restraint or protective physical measures that parents take to teach children? The concept of discipline comes from the root word disciple, which implies a follower. If we understand what disciples do, they follow a leader. Discipline doesn't mean hitting, striking, punishing. It means leading and modeling. And so when we talk about use of physical force in discipline, if you really kind of think about the meanings of those terms, there's a real contradiction in those meanings. But we accept, in America, we accept physical discipline, physical punishment as acceptable discipline up to a certain point. Children are indeed the only group in society that can be hit legally. Murray Strauss is, I believe, a psychologist who has done quite a bit of research in the subject of family violence, and you'll often read Strauss's studies and things when you look into textbooks about domestic violence and physical abuse. And Strauss believes that spanking is harmful, and he believes that, first of all, that it condones the use of violence, and believes that the use of violence in raising our children contributes to violence in society in general. I might add the sociologist in me, I suppose the theoretician in me, sees this the other way as well, that the fact that there is violence in our society that is condoned not only through the use of physical discipline but through violent games and things like that, we accept and support violence. That contributes also to violence in family, but Strauss sees it as the other way around. Learning theorists say that physical discipline is ineffective in achieving desired results, and we'll touch on that in a few more slides as to why that is. And neurobiologists, those who really study the brain and its development, tell us that harsh punishment affects brain development in negative ways. So, does physical punishment do no harm, as many people who endorse the use of physical discipline in raising children, or is that a myth? Most of the experts that Barnett and his associates, her associates, refer to in the textbook say that there are a number of reasons why punishment is likely counterproductive. First of all, it does not help children learn why the behavior is wrong. This is, again, the disciple part. The discipline means that there is a modeling and a teaching that's going on, that the young person is learning from the older person, and physical discipline really doesn't contribute to that learning. The physiological responses associated with being spanked or hit, in fact, might actually prevent the child from learning the lesson, the chemical and biological reactions that go on in the brain, and the fight or flight kicking in the child's system and everything intrudes upon the ability to really think about what is being taught, more or less. And the use of physical punishment also demonstrates that using force enables one to control others, that if you're bigger and you're more powerful, then therefore you can use force or threat of force to get your way. It is likely that children will attribute hostile motivation to others when they're physically disciplined. A lot of studies have demonstrated this. Children may wind up fearing their parents. And that's an interesting thing, because what we find in the field, at least, is children who are raised with harsh punishment, at least, learn to behave themselves when in the presence of that individual who can administer the punishment. They become very well behaved in front of the abusive parent or the parent who administers harsh discipline. When that parent is not around, however, when the punisher isn't in sight, oftentimes what we find is that's when the children act out, because there is no punishment. The internalization of the reasons why a child shouldn't do something or not do something doesn't happen so much in the use of physical discipline. There's a discussion that has to go on again in that disciple process for kids to take the parents' rules and internalize it into something that makes sense to them, so that they practice that when the parents aren't watching. Kids that are controlled by fear through harsh discipline don't have anything to fear when the discipline giver isn't around, and so the lessons aren't really internalized very well. And so that's just another thing to think about there. And also there is this link between love and violence, where kids understand that their parents love them, and in many respects, almost most parents do love their children, even when administering physical discipline, but that somehow there's a confusion of, even though you love me, you hit me. And that can contribute to some major relationship issues later on. And there are what the authors refer to as spillover effects of physical discipline, that it becomes positively correlated with other forms of physical violence, or family violence rather, and connected to a lot of other kinds of behaviors like lying and cheating to try to get out of responsibility for certain things, those kinds of things. So that there's all sorts of other problems that arise from the use of physical punishment. So official estimates indicate that the reports of child physical abuse declined between 1992 and 2004. I ponder that statement, and I'm not quite sure what to say about that, other than that is what the statistics show, that for some reason reported physical abuse, substantiated physical abuse, is declining. Is there a difference in definition? Is there a difference in how states are recording and reaching determinations? Those are some questions that are worth pondering. So there may be other reasons that this number is decreasing, even if the statistics show that it is. However, it would be encouraging to think that parents are hitting children less frequently. Still, nearly 70% of all the child fatalities by physical abuse only were caused by parents in 2008. Child fatalities by physical abuse only were caused by parents in 2008. 7 out of 10. 32% of them occurred in children under 1 year of age. There are teams of experts that convene, and Alaska has this as well, we call them a child fatality review team, or child death review teams, that review records related to the unattended deaths or the violent deaths, accidental deaths of children, and by calling for social service records and police records and medical records to determine what were the contributing causes to the child's death. I think the idea is to collect the data so that as a society we can kind of look at the things that are causing and contributing to children's death and see if there's something we can do about that. This is a term that you pay your tuition to learn, neonaticidal. These are, neonate is a newborn, and so acidal, of course, is like murderous, and so this is a term referring to those who murder newborns, or who murder their young children. So neonaticidal mothers make the news, and if you follow the news over the last several years, Andrea Yates, I think, in fact, she's mentioned in the Barnett textbook, the Texas mother, I believe, that drowned her 4 children in the bathtub, as I recall. And every couple of years there will be another mother. Susan Smith in South Carolina some years ago went on national television with her husband because her daughter disappeared, and it was learned later that, or her children disappeared. It was learned later that she drowned them in a lake in her car. Those kinds of things, it gets a lot of attention when that happens. And generally, these mothers are not mentally ill. They don't have an arrest history, so you wouldn't predict these kinds of things. But sometimes they actually deny the pregnancy and deliver the baby in secret. And actually, as I look at this too, this is really also talking about those mothers that kill their babies at birth, and I think probably this is more what this is about. And again, from time to time you hear about these, and oftentimes they're teenagers or college students who are ashamed of their pregnancy or afraid to tell anybody, don't know what to do with the child, aren't connected to social service organizations, don't want people to know they're pregnant, and so when the baby is born, they murder the child and throw the child in the trash bin or something like that. Interestingly, in 1985, in a survey, 3/4 of parents acknowledged at least one violent act toward their children during their upbringing, and 2% of those persons admitted to abusive violence. I think that tells you there's some underreporting going on in that number, but nonetheless, 3/4 of parents acknowledge using some sort of physical force or physical discipline in raising their kids. And again, later on, still 3/4 of parents reported at least some method of physical assault while raising children. And in that particular study, half admitted to using behavior from the severe physical assault subscale. So at least half of those 75%. So that figure to me rings more true. And a question, why are the rates of physical violence or physical abuse toward children declining? Could it be that social workers and other agents of change are actually making a difference? Or is it that we have more effective psychopharmacological advances to help parents cope with stresses and strains? No one really knows. But Ola Barnett and her associates do say that children who experience physical maltreatment are more likely than their non-abused counterparts to exhibit physical, behavioral, and emotional impairments. Corporal punishment associated with many negative outcomes on into adulthood, and this includes, like I was talking about a little while ago, the fact that the moral code that you want your children to internalize, you teach them right and wrong, and you want them to be able to learn that. And certainly, maybe at first they respond to it because they know they'll be punished if they don't do what is they're told to do, if they don't do the right thing. But ultimately, what you want them doing, of course, is to making those choices because of things based in their own thinking. They have internalized your standards, and so with physical discipline, physical abuse, that doesn't tend to happen very much, and instead, you get kids with poor mental health and more aggressive and antisocial in their behaviors towards other people. The textbook goes into some discussions about the long-term effects of physical abuse, and I just kind of want to touch on what some of those are here. First of all, the physical and mental health effects of abuse, obviously including things like head injuries and abdominal injuries and burns sometimes have very long-lasting effects. Kids that are hit on the head or punched in the abdomen, and yes, that does happen. Parents do that to their children. Sometimes can injure them in ways that last throughout their lives. They're oftentimes chronic pain into old age and experiencing things like depression and all sorts of factors, risk factors like metabolic risk factors and those kinds of things. Poor health later on. Criminal and violent behaviors also are likely to occur in the long run. There's a higher likelihood of arrest for delinquency and criminality in adulthood in violent criminal behaviors. We know that the vast majority of those individuals in prisons we're talking prisons for the long run, have been abused as children, and this is something that we have learned and try to bring to our lawmakers when we talk about trying to get funding for programs and everything, and they talk about where the money is going to come from to come up with more child protection workers or more prevention programs and things to help families. We have to point to the fact that the money that is being used to run prisons and incarcerate individuals would be cut dramatically in the long run if we could create a healthier environment for children in the short run in a prevention mode. Interpersonal adult relationships are going to have difficulties, and there is some indication that says, by the way, in the book that there could be some genetic things that have something to do with the connection between childhood maltreatment and adult violent behavior, but we don't. This is something that's still an area of study. Certainly, we see that substance abuse occurs in the victims of physical abuse over the years. And here you see in different studies that it was related to substance abuse at 12, 16, and 24 years of age for girls, and at 16 and 24 years of age for boys. I'm not sure what the significance of it is that boys don't have the impact at 12 years of age that girls do. The girls start abusing substances. Female child abuse victims seem to start using substances at an earlier age. As we know, significant socio-emotional troubles, poor self-concept, something that is labeled as attention deficit disorder, whether it really is, well, oftentimes we see behaviors that look like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, that really is misdiagnosed, and sometimes that what looks like ADHD may in fact be behaviors that are related to response to physical discipline. And there are certain mediators and moderators that help to determine how severe the effects of the abuse are going to be with a child, and these includes things like the frequency, severity, and duration. More frequent, more severe, longer-term abuse predictably will have more of an impact upon victims. Polyvictimization, somebody who is not only the victim of physical abuse but also of neglect, emotional maltreatment, and sexual abuse, or any combination thereof. Those individuals often experience more severe effects. It's as though the different types of abuse amplify the effects of each other. Prior involvement with Child Protective Services tends to predict that there will be more serious effects of the abuse or neglect in general, and again that has something to do with the frequency and severity. Does the child blame himself or herself? That's going to increase the effects. What kind of stress is there in family? Does the individual live in a violent community? Does the child have intellectual capabilities to separate himself or herself? And again, in a healthy fashion, we're not talking about dissociation, a psychological disorder, a psychological defense mechanism that can be, certainly can be, positive for a short time, but we don't want that in the long run. But we're not talking about that so much as kids that have the intellectual capability to step back from what's going on and to recognize there are other motivating things, other reasons why this abuse is occurring that isn't about them. Sometimes that can help to moderate their effects, and so on, as you see here. A relationship between the victim and the abuser is another thing I'd like to touch on too, because I think most experts would agree that abuse that occurs between an adult and a child, a caretaker, adult caretaker and a child, when there is a close relationship, is likely to be more harmful than abuse that occurs between an individual who isn't as well known or isn't as close to the child, because that harm coming from somebody that you love and trust deeply can really impact your ability to love and trust others at all. So these are just a number of different things that can have an impact upon the child and help to determine, and perhaps explain how some kids pull through these things better than others. The most common physical results of abuse, as we see it in the short run, include bruises and welts and injuries to the chest and abdomen, burns and fractures. One of the most dangerous types of injuries are head injuries, and I talked about that a few moments ago. There are what they call neurobiological injuries that really will affect brain development and can affect things like language and memory and academic skills, cognitive processing, overall intelligence for years to come. Sometimes the kids that are, well, you see child abuse victims, kids that have been victims of severe abuse oftentimes will have difficulty functioning in an academic setting. And it's very possible, if they were struck about the head, that they experienced some brain injuries as a result of that. Children, shaken babies, for instance, and it's really a whole other area that really isn't touched on in this textbook, interestingly, but as I think about this, is something I probably want to try to introduce later on in the semester. But you know, the baby's brain is still very small and is relatively loose inside the head, and so when you have, it's usually the mother's boyfriend, by the way, is usually the person that does this, and the mother goes off to work, the boyfriend's not working, and he's at home, and the baby is crying, and he doesn't have the parenting skills, he doesn't know what to do with this baby, doesn't understand the baby, gets sick and tired of the baby screaming, and picks the baby up and shakes and says, "Shut up, stop yelling, stop crying," and the brain bounces back and forth inside the skull, and well, the best demonstration that I've ever seen of this is to have a little bit of Jello in a container with a lid on it, and shake that container and see that Jello turn from something that is relatively connected to a bit of a mush, and that's what happens with brains when in shaken babies. And so it really does have permanent effects on their intellectual capacities. So that is some of the more severe kinds of results, but there are less severe results. You can be sure of that as well. They do tend to exhibit, children who have been physically abused tend to exhibit lower intellectual and cognitive functioning compared to other children, and just based upon the kinds of things we were just talking about, that's probably not too surprising. And it's interesting also, just to point out to this, is not only the direct injury to the brain perhaps caused by being struck or having one's head pushed against something, but also because of the biological stress response, the hormonal and chemical reactions that occur in the child's system that when it is a repeated kind of a thing can affect the brain's functioning. As I think we were talking about, I was talking about a week or two ago, this idea that the amygdala, the critical response system center of the brain becomes overdeveloped, and kids are always on guard and really can't relax enough to get into their cognitive areas and to think more clearly, and so they don't do well in the classroom. Behaviorally, we see children that are physically aggressive and exhibiting antisocial behaviors a lot of times among these victims. And among older children, this would include drinking and young adults in drinking and substance abuse, but also noncompliance, defiant behavior, fighting, bullying, those kinds of things. Often these are indicators of a child who's been physically abused. And the bond between the parent and the child is most often characterized by an insecure attachment. Our objective in raising our children is to have an attachment with them, a connection to them that is secure, that the children know they can rely upon us to be there when they need us, to provide for their needs, to provide them with emotional support and love, to give them the things that they need to develop into fully functioning human beings, within reason, of course, and those kinds of things. That's a secure attachment, and if you grow up in that kind of an attachment, then it is easier as a human being to be open to others and to be confident with others, so that you tend to be more successful in finding happy relationships, fulfilling relationships that last. However, if you grow up fearing the person that you love and being always on guard to not cross that person, and to feel as though that if you do the wrong thing, or if you get the wrong grade, or you don't do good enough at something, you disappoint them or let them down or just really anger them, when you grow up with those kinds of attachments to the people that are the most important to you, you can understand as an adult, as a young person, as you get older, and as an adult, how difficult it would be to be relaxed and open and to be genuine in interactions with others when you feel like you might have to lie and hide things about yourself. You've grown up believing that. And so that's what happens with insecure attachments, and that is often what occurs with kids that are physically abused. And so this person who is supposed to be the source of safety and is also the source of danger all at one time, and there's a paradox in a relationship that really very often carries over into other relationships in that young person's life throughout their life, and without some really serious intervention sometimes physical abuse victims oftentimes have difficulty connecting with others in a way that gives them meaningful rewards in their human interactions. So that is the conclusion of the first part of this week's lecture. There is another part to come up, so don't go away, but go look for the other link and listen to the second part of the lecture on child physical abuse.